Okay, we're going to get started if that's all right. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. On behalf of BASIC and the Third Nuclear Age Project, I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion on the upcoming first meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats through Norms, Rules, and Principles of Responsible Behaviours. My name is Anuradha Damle, or Anu, and I'm a policy fellow and program manager at BASIC, as well as a PhD researcher on responsible outer space behaviours with the Third Nuclear Age Project at the University of Leicester. To get some logistics out of the way, this meeting is being recorded, but the question and answer session will not be. Please keep your mics off during the panel discussion, and please hold any questions or comments till the end of the panel. You may use the chat function for the duration of the event. Firstly, a huge thank you to everyone that is registered for today. We are joined by civil society, government, diplomats, senators, journalists, industry professionals, and academics, which is a great reflection to us of how interdisciplinary problem solving is key for successful space decision-making and negotiation. In 2020, the UN passed a new resolution on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. Since then, there has been the development of a new open-ended working group, or OEWG, on the same. The first session was due to take place in February of this year, but has now been postponed to next month. The OEWG will work to identify threatening and irresponsible space behaviours. So today we want to answer a few questions. What can be expected from this OEWG? What role can it play in making space a safer domain for everyone? What role can non-governmental experts and civil society play in contributing to the agenda, as well as the implementation of any outcomes of the working group? And finally, what are the possible consensus issues that we may be facing? We're going to start today with a very brief opening remark from Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Eric Desautels, of the Arms Control and Verification Bureau at the Department of State in the US government. Eric, thank you so much for your time, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to BASIC and the Third Nuclear Age Project for the opportunity to speak before this incredible panel. I really appreciate the opportunity and really welcome the thoughts of this panel, because there is a lot of work still to be done on this issue, even though I'm very excited about some of the progress we've been making in this regard. So first, I want to say long-standing bipartisan US government policy is to advance transparency and confidence building measures and norms of behavior in outer space to enable risk reduction measures and increase transparency, which can have the overall effect of enhancing security and stability in outer space. Implementing such multilateral measures that are voluntary, pragmatic, and transparent can build confidence, and it is an important step in addressing misunderstandings and misinterpretations. That is why the United States welcomes this open-ended working group with its inclusive process focused on examining threats to outer space systems, with a particular focus on behaviors that could be considered threatening and developing possible solutions in order to manage perceived threats and risks to space systems. We encourage all UN member states to participate constructively in the upcoming meeting, as we believe it is an important opportunity to build a shared understanding and a shared way forward addressing these critical security issues. And we also welcome the participation of civil society as well. This is not just a problem for major spacefaring nations. It is a common security issue for all nations, as all nations can be threatened by counter space weapons. For example, activities such as jamming of communications or navigation satellites that, if used in peacetime, will increase insecurity, impact civilian lives, and increase the risk of conflict. And clearly there is a shared desire that has been articulated by many countries to maintain space as a peaceful and sustainable environment, and a willingness to work together to reduce threats and to develop measures to prevent conflict from occurring in space. While the United States believes that confrontation or conflict is not inevitable in outer space, we must recognize that outer space remains a domain of competition, and that we must take steps to reduce uncertainty and manage the risk that competition will lead to conflict. The United States believes that the submissions to the UN Secretary General by other countries as part of the 2020 Reducing Space Threats Resolution can form the basis for conversations between member states at the open-ended working group. And we have received submissions from a wide variety of states, like Brazil, Egypt, and Mexico. Of particular note, the prevention of the creation of debris from ASAT tests is a common theme in many of these submissions. In that regard, you will see the United States promoting our commitment not to conduct destructive, direct ascent, anti-satellite missile tests at the open-ended working group. The timing of our announcement by the Vice President on Monday is meant to spur a meaningful discussion in the open-ended working group, as we view this as an important tool in our efforts to multilateralize this commitment. Having our own proposal at the OEWG of a norm of responsible behavior will allow the United States to demonstrate our leadership in this area and to drive a conversation in a way that supports our position and that doesn't undermine US and allied security in the face of what will surely be competing proposals. Beyond this, we believe there is scope for the development of other rules, norms, and principles of responsible behavior that could form the foundation for habits of trust and cooperation between operators in the space environment and reduce the risk of operating in space or the risk of conflict extending into outer space. For example, we recognize that our ASAT commitment doesn't cover all ASAT threats, including space-based ASAT systems. While we think it is important to take a first step to address the most pressing threat, we think the OEWG is an excellent forum for developing concepts to address some of these other threats, given some of the challenges in attribution and definitions. Some areas we hope to see discussed at the OEWG, including enhancing communications, developing best practices or responsible behaviors regarding safe and professional operations of national security satellites in order to avoid potential collisions or other harmful interference, developing commitments around avoiding purposeful interference with satellite command and control systems, and elaborating best practices of responsible behavior that avoid simulating or testing ASAT weapons in the direction of or in close proximity to another state's satellites. Finally, and this will be important, we must take steps to ensure that the work of the open-ended working group does not in any way restrict the peaceful uses of outer space technology by developing countries. So let me say that we look forward to working cooperatively to identify those behaviors and develop and implement those voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible behavior over the coming years that can help minimize the impact of counter-space activities on civil and commercial activities in space, while helping to preserve the outer space environment for the benefit and use of all countries. Thank you for the opportunity to give opening remarks this morning. I look forward to hearing the results of this conference and hearing from some of the other speakers on this incredible panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your time and for setting the scene of what today's discussion is going to be. I'd like to now introduce our first speaker from our excellent panel. Our first panelist is Victoria Sampson, the Washington Office Director for the Secure World Foundation based in the United States. Victoria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you again to BASIC and the Third Nuclear Age for having me as part of this really exciting panel. Just really quickly, for those of you unfamiliar with me or my organization, again, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm here in my kitchen in Washington, D.C. With the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a private organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. So we push for best practices, norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. I was asked to kind of give some opening remarks to talk about, the lead up to the OEWG and why, what's different this time and how did we get here? So just really briefly, let's talk about the history of the UN. Now let's talk about, the way the United Nations looks at space security and stability. Historically, it's been at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. And the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva is a consensus organization, which is great. However, that means you need to reach consensus, and it has not been able to reach consensus on an agenda, much less the topics it's supposed to be discussing for decades now. So that's been one speed bump in making progress on coming to multilateral consensus on space security and stability issues. But also, just as part of, as an observer organization, Secure World co-sponsored or is co-sponsoring a conference every year on space security. So we've had a chance to, watch the discussions being held in Geneva for many years now. And it's just, there's been some major disagreements about the nature of the threat and how to proceed, and that's really hampered further progress on these discussions internationally. There's there's kind of a bifurcation in terms of how countries perceive the biggest threats to space security and stability. Russia, China, and their allies have focused largely on it being the biggest threat to space security is actual physically placing designated weapons in space. And as I say, space-based missile defense interceptors largely. And that's what they've been focusing on that as a threat that they'd like to see handled. And then they focused on a legally binding treaty, some sort of legally binding approach, treaty, to prevent it. And that's where the Prevention and Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, the PPWT, which they first put out for discussion in 2008 and then updated again in 2014. And that's where that came from. That has been criticized for many reasons, not having a strong verification regime, difficulty in compliance, problems with definitions, the fact that it allows for ground-based anti-satellite weapons, that sort of thing. So it's just been kind of floating, gumming up the discussions for a decade and a half now. But the problem is that there hasn't really been alternative until now to speak about. The US and its allies have focused on the biggest threats to space security and stability as being more a function of almost environmental issues, contested, that sort of thing. And then pushing for, there's been a shift lately about moving away from discussions of space security as being, okay, we're going to try and limit or ban technologies, but focusing more towards looking at behavior. And that's where there's actually been a real shift recently, where there's actually a possibility for moving ahead. In December 2020, the UK, US, and some consortium of other groups promoted UN General Assembly Resolution 75/36, which asked for countries to send submissions to the UN Secretary General on what they deem to be the nature of the threat to space. What do they see as responsible or alternatively irresponsible behavior? And then how do they recommend moving forward in the discussions? Because that's been a stopping point. It's very hard to come up with solutions when you can't even agree on what the problem is or what your end goal is. And so looking at that, about 30 countries submitted reports to the Secretary General, which is great. Civil society was allowed to submit reports as well. I know Secure World did, and a couple other people on this panel and other organizations did as well, and that's been interesting reading. But looking at the 30 plus reports, you do see some commonalities arise in terms of what nations see as the biggest threat to space security and stability. Or what they would like to see in terms of responsible behavior, the idea of acting with due regard, the idea of avoiding harmful interference. And again, those are not necessarily new issues. Those are concepts within the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, but it's encouraging to see countries highlight those as things they'd like to see move ahead in terms of responsible behavior. And then also some newer things that are not necessarily encapsulated in earlier agreements. The idea of no non-consensual close approaches, the idea that it's considered bad form to get close to another country's satellite without their approval or understanding. It's considered bad form to deliberately create long-lived debris. Which is good, because I think that really fed into other growing concepts about what is considered responsible behavior. Last summer, the US Secretary of Defense put out a memo detailing 5 tenets of responsible behavior in space. And that kind of highlighted a lot of those concepts that we're also picking up as we're seeing in these international discussions from the response to 7536, which I think is good. I think it indicates that there's kind of a groundswell movement in terms of generally getting the train towards one point, the idea that we're coming to some sort of agreement. And so that was followed up by just this past December, a follow-up resolution, the General Assembly Resolution 76/231, which created an open-ended working group, which is supposed to meet 4 times this year and next year, with a goal of developing recommendations on possible norms, rules, principles of responsible behavior relating to threats to states for their space systems. So that was originally supposed to start meeting in February of this year. It was not, due to some definitional issues by some of the participants. But as Eric mentioned, that they'll be meeting next month in Geneva in May. So this is really exciting because, as I said before, you see from the submissions, the early resolution, there's kind of, we're starting to see, gelling of responses in terms of what's identified responsible behavior. We have, the U.S. Secretary of Defense putting out his 5 tenets of responsible behavior. And then, of course, as Eric mentioned as well, just this week, it's been a long week, I think it was 3 days ago, that the U.S. government announced that they would be committing to not conducting destructive direct descent anti-satellite missile tests, with the idea of not creating large amounts of debris in space, which is great. My organization put out a statement fully supporting this, because it is extremely damaging to the space environment. Looking through the course of the space age, there have been about 16 anti-satellite tests that created debris in space, and these anti-satellite tests were conducted by the U.S., Russia, China, and India. So of those anti-satellite tests, they created about 6,300 pieces of trackable debris. And of course, the key term is trackable, because there's probably thousands of other pieces of debris that was too small to be tracked, but are still created from this, but it could still be damaging. But of those 6,300 pieces of trackable debris, about 4,400 are still in existence, and some of this debris has been around for 5+ decades. It could be around for much longer. So hopefully, with the U.S. Announcement, this may give some shape and some consideration, and kind of give the delegates a starting point for discussion, so that we can see some progress and hopefully get whether or not there is consensus out of the OEWG. I think it's very helpful to have these discussions to get the international community on the same page for what they see as responsible behavior, and then countries can take the information they learn at these sessions, and whether or not there's a treaty, or whether or not there's a UN resolution, whether or not there's a report, there's nothing stopping them from taking information they learn at these meetings and incorporating them into how their national viewpoints are on these discussion points. There's nothing stopping them, for example, from making their own unilateral announcements about debris causing anti-satellite tests. So with that, I think I've reached my time limit. I'm very excited to hear about the rest of the panel has to say, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was really great contextualizing of the conversation for today, and I'm really grateful that you joined us. So thank you. I'm excited to hear you in the Q&A as well. But for now, we have Dr. Blethenbouwen, who is Associate Professor at the University of Leicester. Thank you for joining us, Blethen. Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anu, and thanks to BASIC for setting this up as well, and then thanks for the invitation to speak here today. So first off, apologies, there's a little bit of construction work going on in the building, and they've been quiet all morning, and I've just started hearing drilling again. So apologies if that comes through on the microphone. So I just have a few basic remarks, really, and I was asked to comment on sort of the impact of past or current conflicts on the open-ended working group process, and I found it very difficult to think of something smart and useful and insightful to say here that I guess many people tuning in today probably haven't already thought about themselves, especially as the process hasn't actually properly started yet. And of course, there is a major war going on in Europe right now. But a few points I have written down, I think, and building on what Victoria was saying, I think the key positive from this is that the conversation is happening at all. And we heard about the problems at the Conference of Disarmament, and in particular in Paros, the Committee on the Prevention of the Arms Race in Outer Space, which has been log-jammed for longer than I've been alive on these issues, which is a fair amount of time. So the fact that this conversation is now happening outside of that at all, where there's a lot more that needs to be talked about in space that isn't preventing an arms race in space. And of course, the very idea of what an arms race actually is not straightforward. Nobody has an agreed definition of what actually constitutes an arms race in outer space, because in the field of international relations, nobody actually agrees on what an arms race on Earth is, let alone in space. But that aside, I think this process is really important because it is the forum to try and get any sort of discussions on managing outer space and outside of sort of the big institutions that are already doing it, like the International Telecommunications Union, which is already governing orbital resources and radio frequencies. So that in itself is good. We'll have to see whether any consensus is reached, but I think Victoria is right in that you don't necessarily need a consensus for it to serve a constructive purpose. So I think that's a sort of a positive to take. And I guess I'm setting my expectations quite low here. And I think that's something I think everybody should bear in mind. Try not to have expectations that this is going to solve loads of problems, especially when it's been billed so far as identifying threats or identifying what the problems are in space. So we're not even at the point of trying to figure out solutions. We're still at the agenda setting phase, really. So it's really early days, but the fact that a conversation is happening is the important thing. And that in the context, think of absolutely no appetite for any major treaty. And there have been lots of discussions for many years, which Victoria already alluded to, regarding the PPWT. There is no appetite for any serious, big treaty at this point. So the only alternative is to talk about these things and try and get some norms, soft law, or just try and identify smaller things, less legally binding things through. And in the past few years, it's interesting to see the US position evolve, really, where it's as an outsider looking in, it seems like the United States has realized that it can't just not engage with the PPWT and the Conference on Disarmament, but not do anything or not be seen to be doing anything regarding norms or soft law or trying to do something else in terms of space governance and addressing space security issues on a more diplomatic multilateral level. So the test ban moratorium from the United States is a good move, but it is quite a modest move as well. However, we have to bear in mind that hopefully one of the strengths of the UN General Assembly process is that it is going to be hopefully more inclusive and multilateral than other things. And this can be a challenge perhaps to some countries which aren't particularly in favor of very multilateral approaches. So I think that as the process goes, it'll be interesting to see if ongoing conflicts, whether in terms of wars going on around the world, but also conflicts of interest in various forums, whether you start getting certain countries using this as a way to address grievances in general, rather than actually trying to get a process in terms of space governance. So I think a challenge, for everyone involved in the process who wants to get some outcomes in space is to try and keep it inclusive and multilateral as much as possible. So with phrases like US leadership, I think stuff like that has to be quite carefully managed, I think, because it is meant to be a multilateral effort. So we wouldn't want a repeat of what's happened to the EU Code of Conduct, where inside the actual Code of Conduct proposals, which the United States eventually supported, the EU's proposals had a lot of good stuff in there, but it just did not it wasn't presented and handled in diplomatically the right way, which my fellow panelists would probably know much more about than I do in detail. So I hope that the UN General Assembly effort and the resolutions helps do what failed there. But we have to bear in mind that, of course, the US-Russia relations, and of course Europe and Russia now, many European states and Russia, that is going to, I think, make the UN General Assembly effort more challenging than it would have been when the process was started a couple of years ago, but not impossible. And to be uncharacteristically optimistic, there are so many problems that need addressing in space in terms of governance, even on the most basic level, that there'll be a continuing need for this kind of conversation in some way, not necessarily at the UN, but in some way. So the fact that this might be mainstreaming space governance outside of Vienna and Geneva is possibly good, because as Victoria said, a lot of delegates and people in different countries are learning a lot more about these issues now because it's been done in this way. And we will be coming back to these issues for many, many, many years, because space traffic management, space situational awareness, data sharing, collision avoidance, traffic protocols, TCBMs, all those things we're going to carry on talking about these. So even if this doesn't amount to anything much, it's going to lay the foundation for what comes next. And much of the language in the Outer Space Treaty started off as resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly. So we don't really know where this will end up. And I think it's important to note, because it's easy to get into the dichotomy of the PPWT treaty versus norms and soft law. I think the British have said that this doesn't necessarily mean there can't be a treaty at some point that deals with some of these issues. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Now, it doesn't mean you have to like the PPWT, but you don't know where this process ends up. So things don't really look good in terms of getting Russia and Europe and the United States to agree on things between them right now. But I'm thinking 10, 15, 20 years, we'll still be talking about these things. And I'm sure there will be some form of agreements between some countries, or perhaps many countries, within that time scale. So uncharacteristically optimistic, but in the short term, I'm not expecting much, but you never know where these discussions lead. And as more and more people get involved, it becomes, less predictable, but it changes the character of it from what we've seen over the last 40, 50 years in Geneva and Vienna, which I think is very much due a change, to be honest. I think Paros has had enough time to block everything. I think it's time to move on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bethan-Bowen. That was a great look backwards and forwards. I really like the point that you made about that this is actually a foundation for a conversation that's going to last a very, very long time. But now we have to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker today is Dr. Raji Rajagopalan, who is the Director for the Center of Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in India. Raji, over to you.
Thank you, Anu, and my thanks also to BASIC and Third Nuclear Age for hosting this webinar on this important theme, and of course having me on this panel to share some thoughts. So a lot has been said in terms of why we are here, the criticality of space security threats in the backdrop of the major powers relations, which are worsening in some sense, which is going to be contributing further to the impeding the process of global rulemaking exercise that could possibly restrain some of the bad behaviors that we have been seeing in space. Of course, there is nothing new, very new out here. Space security governance has been under stress for quite some time. But I would add that the Ukraine conflict, for instance, has further sharpened the divisions among the major powers. And whether it is in terms of dealing with growing space security threats in the form of ASATs, kinetic ASAT tests, ASAT weapons, or cyber and electronic warfare, all of these are meant to interfere with each other's satellite operations, causing harm to one's opponent's space assets. So all of these offensive capabilities, whether it is talking about jammers, lasers, cyber weapons, this all could damage satellite operations. But sadly, these have become a reality in recent times. And if this is not halted, these developments could eventually make space inaccessible. And that really brings out the importance of the OEWG at this point of time. These developments are also diluting the existing norms, which have been prevalent for several decades now, whether it is in terms of the norm to not test ASAT weapons, which has been broken since 2007. The norm to not interfere in each other's satellite operations, again, has been violated several times in the last decade, not to create harmful interference in space operations. All of these are serious issues, and this is a slippery slope, which in fact makes restoration of these norms a lot more challenging if it is not really appropriate steps are not taken at this point of time. But all of these issues are important irrespective of which camp or group of countries you belong to, because it affects everyone. Whether it is, for instance, a space debris is not going to discriminate between a Western and a non-Western country. In fact, the UK minister, when talking after the vote in November on the OEWG, he said space security is an important, prevention of arms race in outer space is a UK priority. But like Eric said, I think this is a priority not just to the UK or a certain group of countries. It is a priority for all, irrespective of the region or the stage of development, because literally every single country has come to rely on space one way or the other. But of course, the path to securing space is different, and I think there is no united or a shared common approach to dealing with space security threats. But this is, again, not new. Even in the past, there has not been one unified approach among all the countries agreeing upon a certain. In fact, looking at the past, it has been more of a top-down approach. But today, the new contextualizing factor is the great power competition. And so the key question is, where do we go from here? So like I said, irrespective of the geography, space security is going to be affecting all of us equally. And the challenge is, of course, to narrow down the differences between states in how we deal with them. Since you asked me to look at things from a non-Western perspective or in providing Indian perspective, let me try and identify 3 points that have been emphasized by many countries in the non-Western context, non-Western countries in a sense, whether they are dealing with space security and arms control issues or even nuclear and disarmament issues. So first is that these issues need to be addressed in an established multilateral platform such as the United Nations or its associated institutions. Here, I think the open-ended working groups go as well, since this is established through a UN vote, a UN route in a sense, something that is going to be appealing to a number of non-Western states. Many non-Western states have also said that CD, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, must remain the sole multilateral platform for debating security-related issues pertaining to space, nuclear, and arms control agreements. Even though the CD has been stalemated for more than 2 decades with not even an adoption of even the annual program of work, it suggests the serious inflexibilities among the major powers today. And this could continue to impede any progress on all arms control initiatives, including space security. In fact, even India, for instance, has repeatedly taken this position. Even in February 2020, the Indian ambassador said that CD is the world's single multilateral disarmament negotiating forum, as mandated by the final document, blah, 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 blah. So reiterating the importance of the CD and that all of these issues must be taken up within the UN and CD as a single institution that would debate on space security and related issues. A second issue is the principle of consensus. Consensus has remained a key principle for India and much of the non-Western world, because there is a fear that in the absence of the consensus principle, their voice may not be heard. So countries like India, for instance, have articulated that it does not favor dilution of the consensus principle while making decisions at the CD. Again, this has been articulated by the Indian leadership from the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2020s, one has heard these kind of repeatedly these kind of statements. Again, this is not restricted to just India, but I think this has been the view or perspective of many of the non-Western Asian countries, for certainly. These viewpoints have been coming through very, very clearly. But absence of consensus has also meant absence of progress. One, and I think one of the most more recent and important example is the 2018-19 GG on PAROS, the group of governmental experts on PAROS, which did not really end up producing a consensus report. So it really talks to you loud and clear about the seriousness and the serious inflexibilities in terms of the positions taken by states. And this could continue to be sort of an impediment in developing, in making progress on some of these issues. A third point is the general perception of a number of non-Western countries who prefer to develop legally binding instruments than political agreements. Again, these positions have been very, very clear, whether it is India or other countries in the Asian context, who have insisted on legally binding and verifiable treaties, both within the CD as well as within the COPUOS. again, India has articulated that the role of the CD is to negotiate legal instruments that have significant and long-lasting collective security benefits. Somehow the whole assumption is that once you have a legally binding mechanism, it's a magic mantra, it's going to solve all your problems. I really don't believe in that. That's really the case, especially at this point of time when the great power competition or the major power competition has peaked. But this is, I'm just putting out the Indian or the non-Western perspective in a India as well as other countries have articulated that while non-discriminatory and universally acceptable TCBM's transparency and confidence building measures can be useful complementary measures, the objective should be to develop and negotiation of a legally binding instrument that enhance security in space for all space users. And I think in some sense, when you look at it, this has remained the traditional position for a number of different countries. But I think in some countries, at least, this position has evolved to at least appreciate the utility of transparency and confidence building measures, as well as other political agreements as a first baby step before coming to essentially developing the consensus for developing legally binding instruments. But I think this is still a long road ahead. I don't think we have clarity, because even with the OEWG votes, we have seen some of the major powers staying on the sidelines, all because they felt that the responsible behavior, that term, can be defined in a subjective fashion. So the possibility of subjective interpretation of terms like responsible behavior has led many countries in the non-Western context to stay on the sidelines, which is not exactly the smartest thing to do, but that's where India or many of the other non-Western countries' position has been on this. So let me stop there, and I think I may have overshot my time. Thank you.
Not at all. That was incredibly interesting. Thank you for reiterating the point about interpretation and subjectiveness when it comes to sort of implementation of these agreements, because I think that, you know, universality is such a big problem in general in these negotiations. So thank you for driving that point home, Raji. And our final panelist before our discussant, last but not least, is Dr. Jessica West, who is Senior Researcher at Ploughshares in Canada. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica, and take it away.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I was asked to speak very briefly to outcomes that I would like to see from the OEWG, as well as the role of civil society, or why we need to be there. So I'll try not to summarize too much of what others had said. Outcomes are tricky. As it's been pointed out, this is a series of sort of 4 weeks of meetings. And so what do we expect? I think one point that hasn't been raised that I find important, though, is to settle on what we're doing through the working group meeting. And, you know, it's focused on norms, but norms themselves are rooted in principles. And I think my sense is that we have a bit of a crisis of principles in outer space when it comes to security. And I think a key role of the working group would be to be able to reinforce the key principle of peace in space and the peaceful use of outer space. I think this is really the core sentiment that informs the Outer Space Treaty, that informs the work at the UN First Committee. And it's the key way in which I think we can bring together the vast diversity of stakeholders in outer space. I think the comments that we heard this week coming out of the United States about the fact that conflict is not inevitable in space are really helpful towards allowing us to take a step back from the rhetorical focus on warfighting that has become really kind of loud over the last few years, and refocus on, you know, what we can do to reestablish and to maintain peace in space. Second, I think a key value of the working group will be to bring more stakeholders into this conversation. All states have a stake in space. Bledden mentioned that you know, the work of the group is really about agenda setting. And I think it's important to make sure that we create an agenda that meets the interests of as many states and other space stakeholders as possible, and that can try to work to bridge the divides that Raji and Victoria spoke to, which have really resulted in an unfortunate stalemate for decades. And so thinking through how this process can lead to practical measures down the road, including possible arms control agreements, is really important. And I know we're kind of on the fence on consensus. On the one hand, consensus is important. On the other, it's been weaponized in some other, weaponized isn't a great word, but it's been used to block progress in other forums. But I think we still need to aim for consensus at the working group. I think we have to hold ourselves to a high standard, because if we're not aiming for it, we certainly won't get there. And if the whole point of the working group is to lay the foundation of future work, then we really need to make sure the foundation is strong. And that means being able to listen and engage across different perspectives and try to build common understandings of the problems, as Victoria said, but also of what the solutions might be. I think one key way to do this is to build on the existing framework of law and principles and norms. And I like how that is specifically mentioned in the resolution. Individual norms don't exist independently of each other. They're relational, and efforts to build new norms need to take this into consideration. And I think you see the value of that approach when you see the positive reactions to efforts to ban destructive anti-satellite tests, because it builds on, it resonates with a prevailing principle of sustainability in space, and it builds on existing commitments, and that helps us move forward quickly. But ultimately, how do we get there is really about process. I think what we get out of the working group depends on what we put into the working group. And so my hope is that it will establish itself as an open, inclusive, and transparent process that can facilitate the kind of conversations we need in order to build common understandings of security and insecurity in space, and also a renewed spirit of cooperation and trust. And I know those words are kind of hard to believe in sometimes, but we won't get there if we don't try. So really the process is the product. And at the end of the day, norms are not the words that we put on the paper, but the ways in which we interact with one another, the behaviors that we observe, and the processes that we follow. And achieving this requires an iterative and ongoing process, as Blevin spoke to. This is sort of the beginning of something that will stretch out for a long period of time. But its success depends on inclusion. And inclusion, in my mind, requires the active participation of civil society. Civil society organizations are essential stakeholders in space. We need to be part of this conversation. Many organizations have been advocates of efforts on concrete actions related to PEROS and peace and security in space for many decades, and they've developed unique experience along the way, while others bring novel perspectives and experiences gained elsewhere to bring to the conversation. And I think it behooves us to include this expertise and experience in the process. Importantly, the expertise that civil society brings can help contribute diverse perspectives to the conversation. Civil society can help bring a holistic approach that goes beyond more narrow national security concerns, which states have to represent, I believe, at the table. But we can facilitate incorporating perspectives and experiences that draw on principles such as human and sustainable development, humanitarian protection, gender perspectives, commercial interests. I think we help broaden the diversity of perspectives at the table, which can lead to success down the road. Civil society also helps to incorporate broad stakeholders beyond states, including academia and technical experts and commercial actors. We are often uniquely placed to bridge these various communities and conversations and sort of bring the sum of the parts to the table, if you will. And I think the work of civil society also facilitates inclusion through our work on awareness and capacity building, through efforts to engage and network with a diversity of relevant stakeholders, to do research, to develop guidance, to work with the public. I think civil society is key to bringing the conversation to a wider audience and bringing the wider audience to the conversation. And these activities are also essential to the success of norms down the road through socialization and implementation. We don't have norms if they're not implemented. We don't have norms if they're just words on paper. And I think the work that civil society does on awareness and capacity building also helps us to implement norms down the road. And civil society also contributes to monitoring and promoting compliance with norms, which is key to accountability, and also provides incentives to comply. I think I have colleagues that work on the Arms Trade Treaty Monitor, and I think that's a great example. But we have other examples of open source information on space, including counterspace reports that help bring light to the activities that are going on in space. And this is all part of sustaining and promoting norms. So I guess to do all of this, it's essential that civil society be involved in the process from the very beginning. So I really hope that we get a seat at the table, or at least ears in the room. Nurturing peace and security in space really does require an inclusive approach, and civil society is key to this kind of inclusion. So I guess I'll leave it there. I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion, and I want to make sure that we have time for lots of questions.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And I think the key word to take away from what you contributed there was inclusion and inclusivity in the process, and how important that is, and the very unique role that civil society plays in bridging the gaps between the conversation behind closed doors and actually implementing what's going on. So thank you so much. We're going to move to our discussant in a second. I just want to remind everyone that following our wonderful discussant's first question to the panel, we will be opening the Q&A. You can raise your hands from any point after the discussant has finished speaking, and I will add you to the queue. Please keep your questions short, concise, try and avoid comments rather than questions if possible. And please do feel free to use the chat box if you're unable to ask your question verbally. Before that, though, I have the pleasure of introducing Nivedita Raju, who is our discussant for the day, who is from CIPRI. So, Nivedita, really interested to hear what you have to say. You have the hardest job for today. Take it away.
Thanks, Anu, and thank you to BASIC for the invitation, and to all the speakers for their excellent presentations. I guess my question is twofold. I have 100, but I'm going to try and pack everything in. So first, we know that states have raised multiple focus areas, which we can see in the submissions. And I think Victoria mentioned this, that there's some common ground here across the submissions. ASAT testing, electronic interference, non-consensual RPOs. But at the same time, we know that states have different priorities. And in fact, other states have been reticent to even specify what their concerns are in the submissions. So since this first substantive session of the OEWG will take stock of existing frameworks, I wanted to ask the panel what recommendations or warnings can you share to make sure that we're effectively engaging in these discussions on governance, keeping all these varying priorities in mind. Bleddyn did touch upon this briefly and reminded us of the lessons to be learned from the EU and then international code of conduct. So I hope to hear more from him and our panelists. And related to this subject of specific priorities, with this unilateral declaration made by the US now, what steps can be taken at the session to work towards banning destructive ASAT tests, and how can we use this foundation, and how can we navigate the conversation around the form of such a ban? Yeah, those are my two questions for the panel.
Thank you so much, Nivedita.